everybody, and welcome to Climate Diet's podcast, Climate and Cuisine. My name is Jane DeMarines, and I'm the Executive Director of Climate Diet, and we are thrilled today to have with us Dr. Janet O'Shea, professor from UCLA, professor in food and politics, and we have a lot to talk about. Certainly this month is a good time to talk about food. We have two holidays, Passover and Easter this month, so talking about food is a perfect time, I think. But today, of course, we're interested in food and the climate, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So welcome, Dr. O'Shea. It's great to have you back again.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So let's just get right to it. You recently published a wonderful article, an opinion piece with several of your colleagues in Newsweek magazine. And it was on Valentine's Day, so not sure if that was a gift of love to the world. We'll have to delve into that a bit. But maybe you want to just talk about this piece. I'll mention the title, Even One Person's Food Choices Affect the Whole Planet. And I believe that. And it certainly seems to be a stark admonition to the world that we can't maintain the Paris Accord limit of 1.5 degrees, or I should say goal of 1.5 degrees centigrade, without reductions in greenhouse gases like methane, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, and many of those come from food in very large amounts. So if you'd like to talk a little bit about your point of view from that article, let's get to it.
Sure. Well, I guess let's begin with that main point, or I guess it's kind of a crux point of what we were trying to say in the article, that we can't we can't address the climate crisis without addressing the problems in the food system. And from all the research that I've seen, that's absolutely true. And it really makes sense that that would be true when we think about how much pollution is created by the food system and by animal agriculture in particular. Things like waste lagoons, things like methane, things like the monocropping that is used to feed livestock. All of those things have an enormous impact on our environment, and it would be very strange if somehow we could address the climate crisis without addressing that. So the science of it, and in a sense, the practicalities kind of align there. And I think it's also worth saying that from a social justice standpoint, we really need to get past this false dilemma that we can either address the fossil fuel problem or we have to address the food problem, because from a social justice standpoint, both of them do enormous environmental harm. They're incredibly harmful to frontline communities, to workers, to consumers. It's, that old saying about what if the climate crisis, what if climate change is a hoax and we build a better world for nothing, right? And so we can certainly have conversations about addressing fossil fuels versus addressing animal agriculture, but in a way, all of it is about building this better world that we need. Is by addressing both of those things, we in a sense build a better world.
I totally agree with you, and I'm so glad you brought up the social justice aspects of it, and the things like the lagoons that are so dangerous in some communities, particularly in the South. There's been there's a documentary called, now I probably can't think of it.
Is it The Smell of Money? Is that the documentary?
Money?
About The Smell of Money?
The smell of money, exactly. And so disgusting, and cancer rates are so high in neighborhoods that are near those pig farms and the lagoons there, and they're spraying it into the air. It's really a very sad commentary that we can't get more controls over companies like that are getting away with it. I hope some of that has stopped. I know there have been some lawsuits. But getting back to the premise of, well, I guess I'd just like to ask you if you want to say again, or say with a more detail, that you and your co-authors in the Newsweek piece really disagree with the claim that people going vegan or plant-based or going toward it's definitely reducing meat consumption, does little to address the climate crisis. I was going to say Dr. Gerard Bishop from Australia is out there and sort of newly saying that animal agriculture is the leading cause of climate change. And I I don't think he's the first, but he certainly has a lot of credibility in the work that he's done. Um, and he's saying 53%.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear your opinion on any of that.
Yes. So this is the stuff that I find really interesting because I'm not a scientist, I'm a humanities scholar. And I'm a humanities scholar who is really interested in science. And part of that is because the scientific results we get depend so much on how we ask the question. And that is not, sometimes people then see that as a failing of science, and like that's not a failing. That's actually what's really interesting is how you build the question. So with Dr. Bishop's research, as I understand it, he's taking into account the opportunity cost in terms of the
Yes.
deforestation that accompanies animal agriculture, right? And a lot of scientific analyses don't take that into account. And so that was actually the starting point for us writing this op-ed, which was there was an author who had written an op-ed. The title was "Don't Bother Going Vegan to Save the Planet, Do This Instead." And his argument was people shouldn't focus on the food system. They should put money and resources into clean technology. He happens to be a master's student who's getting a degree in sustainable technology. So his argument was like, you should invest in startups. And it was like, well, that's a little self-serving, possibly. So there is a little bit of author bias there. But the other part of it that I thought was really interesting is that he cited a scientific study that claimed if all the United States went vegan, we would only reduce our carbon emissions by 1%. But when you look at that study, the authors assumed two things that I think are really flawed and really telling. One is that they made the assumption that all of our food waste that's not consumed by humans, they made the assumption that that is going to feed livestock, which is a really flawed assumption because that's kind of this like family farm idea of, you have the pig outside that you're just handing the apple cores to. And in fact, that's not the case at all. We're actually raising monocrops to feed livestock. So that's a hugely flawed assumption. And then they assumed that that food waste wouldn't be composted, it would be burned. And so they were arguing like, well, our carbon emissions would go up because we'd be burning all this food waste. Instead of thinking, well, if we could move away from animal agriculture, then surely we can move towards composting. That's not impossible. And in fact, composting at a large scale is necessary if we want to raise plants for human consumption. And then there was an additional flaw to the logic. So I guess there were really three flaws, and that was that they assumed that land use would remain exactly the same. And of course, that's really central to what Dr. Bishop and other people are saying is that if we reduce our animal consumption, then we reduce our land use, and then that land could be used for rewilding. So that was really our starting point for the for writing that op-ed. And then from there, we also were really interested, and I'm particularly interested in this question, which is that the critique of behavior change as an environmental solution, it sets up a false dilemma that we can either change our behavior or we can try to change society. And those things are not at odds. For many of us, changing our behavior is part of advocating to change our society. But also the idea that behavior change is not a solution, it really comes out of the efforts to address fossil fuel consumption. And these are different industries. And I think that's really important to understand that the industries are structured differently, consumption is structured differently. So like with fossil fuels, it's like, okay, well, I could lower the AC at home and I can choose not to run the AC at home. I can, get a fan instead or open the windows. But then I go to my office and the AC might be blasting. And so I can't do anything about that. But with food, I'm making choices 3 times a day and I have control over that. So if I make my plant-based breakfast, and then I come to work and I order something at an on-campus restaurant, or if my department puts on an event and I order the vegan meal, I'm still pushing those market signals. So even when I'm operating in an institutional setting, when it comes to food, I can still nudge the market signals. And then also when it comes to food, we can cause institutional shift at a much smaller scale than just at the level of federal policy. So with something like fossil fuel consumption, we can try to do that, but it's very hard in like a school or a workplace to try to get them to adopt a green policy. But we can very easily get a school or a community group or a recreational group to adopt like greener by default, for example. And that's another way that then we can start to engage in institutional shift. And so when we look at the food system, that argument that behavior change is a distraction, it's not actually system change, it really doesn't hold up.
No, it absolutely doesn't. And I'm glad to hear you debunk that article, which seemed to have so many flaws. But in general, surveys and recent ones, I believe the one I'm going to quote from was Pew Charitable Trust, but Rutgers also did one, and it had to do with what do people feel, how are they looking toward food, and it specifically asked about meat reduction. And 2/3 of the one that I believe was a younger generation, and I forget the ages, but teens to I think mid 20s or maybe 30, said 2/3 of that group said they were reducing their meat consumption, particularly ruminants, so particularly red meat, and the ones releasing methane, so the most dangerous ones for the environment. So that is hugely hopeful. Even though it's a segment of the population, it's, I think, hugely hopeful to see that many agreeing and being aware that what they're eating is polluting the environment, or if they're doing it for their health, I think they're aware of it for the climate, however. But if they're doing it for their health, all the better as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's very much true. And there have also been studies, like for example, in the UK, where a very large number, increasing numbers of young people are going vegan and vegetarian. So I think there really is an awareness, particularly among younger generations, that behavior change is really related to what's going on systemically. And part of the reason why we're not seeing, because there's also a lack of hopefulness sometimes, I think, paradoxically, even in the animal advocacy communities, where sometimes people will make the claim like, oh, we're actually not winning in trying to improve our food system. And the problem there is that there are like these two competing arcs. There's in the wealthier countries, more and more people are realizing that there is an environmental impact to their eating, and there's an ethical impact, there's a social justice impact. And more people are becoming vegan or vegetarian, or they're adopting reducitarian practices where they're limiting their meat consumption. And at the same time, we're seeing a rising middle class in some of the poorer countries. And so there is an increase in meat consumption that goes along with that. But a rising middle class is not a bad thing, right? So I think we need to also remember that it is the job of the wealthy countries and people in the wealthy countries to fix this problem, because we're the ones who've created it. And in fact, we are moving towards fixing it. So that is really hopeful.
I'm glad to hear you bring up the UK and what is going on in Europe. And I think Amsterdam, certainly Europe is much more aware, and maybe it's because they have they're smaller land masses. The United States is a big country, and they're much smaller. So raising cattle would be prohibitive on the scale that we do it here, or is done in Brazil, for example. But their awareness level at one point, and I looked at this just maybe a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, but Amsterdam, for example, had a goal of having veganism 30, I think by 2035, 50% of their city be vegan. So it's such a great, goal, I think, to move toward that. And the UK, I know I read something, the awareness level, I think in the UK was 30% were certainly aware of the benefits of veganism. I'm not sure how many are vegans, but the awareness level was much higher, where in the United States at the time of this survey was like 10%. And I think that's changed definitely over the last 2 years, because I do think that was about 2 years ago. But there's definitely a faster adoption, I think, of veganism in Europe. And again, I think it has to do with how much land they have.
Absolutely. And it really makes sense in the Netherlands that they would be concerned about the climate impacts of food production, both because it's a smaller country and then also because it's a low-lying country, right? With like water
Yeah.
all around. So that makes sense that there would be that awareness. And then there's things like Denmark. What Denmark is doing is incredible, where they're really trying to find that sweet spot between individual behavior change and policy and institutional shifts, where they've adopted this policy of trying to reduce meat consumption in a pretty ambitious way. And they're approaching it, I think, from such a kind of you use the word hopeful, and I think what Amsterdam is doing is very hopeful. It's very optimistic. It's very positive, because they're doing things like training chefs and working on menu design. And there's all sorts of interesting stuff about choice architecture that, if you place like the plant-based meal at like the top of the menu, and if you include the plant-based options in and amongst the other entrees rather than having a separate menu, that will increase the selection of those items. And that's the kind of thing they're working on in Denmark is like, okay, so how do we actually design the menus? How do we just describe these entrees so they sound appealing? And I think that's just such a thoughtful and intelligent way of approaching this, and also one that I think really focuses on the positive aspects of it, that people can explore new kinds of food and new kinds of tastes and have these wonderful culinary experiences. It's not all, addressing the climate crisis is not all about sacrifice.
That is very, very interesting. I did not know this about Denmark, but now I'm dying to read more about it and find out more. But you bring up something, I'll just throw this in. My daughter is the reason that my husband and I are vegan. And she gave us the book, The China Study, 25 years ago, and we read it and became vegetarians first and then vegans. But uh, she doesn't do this all the time, but she did it for a while. She worked with restaurants to teach them how to offer vegan recipes, and she made her own vegan meatballs and took them in to one of the restaurants near her. She lives in Tampa, Florida, and they loved them, and they started offering it on their menu. And we went to that restaurant with her one time and had them, and they were delicious. But there are people that are trained to do this because she took a course, and it's basically to train you how to work with restaurants in your area to help them do what it sounds like they're doing in Denmark, how to offer vegan options that just also recognize that there are a lot of people moving in this direction. And even if you're not, it's healthy for you.
Yeah, exactly. And right. And even if you're not moving in that direction, like there's it still might be appealing and tasty. And I think that's part of it too, right? Is that like that's a whole thing with choice architecture and like things like greener by default, is that like if you set something up where the default option is meat, it's only the people who are vegan and vegetarian who are going to opt out and say like, oh, can I order the vegetarian option? Whereas if you do it the other way around, the people who are meat eaters won't necessarily say, oh no, I have to have meat at every single meal. Even if their normal choice inclination would go in that direction, if it's the default, then they'll actually say, oh yeah, that actually sounds really great. The the chickpea grain bowl with tahini dressing sounds fantastic. Yeah, no problem. I don't have to look for an alternative.
So I want to make sure that we talk a minute about the course that you're teaching and food as a lens for the environment and sustainability. And I guess you've addressed this a little bit, but I'd love it if you would just go back to it a bit and talk about the topics such as the perceived split between behavior and policy change, and just address that a little bit more. I think it's
Yeah.
huge.
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to, because that's something that I think is really fun about teaching on this course is that I get to teach about the structure of activism, among other things. So I work with this group of colleagues, my co-authors, who are scientists, two scientists and a mathematician, actually. And one of the things that the scientists on the course teach about is they teach about planetary boundaries, and then they introduce the idea of the uh, Eat Lancet Planetary Health Diet Guidelines. The journal, the science journal, The Lancet, put together these guidelines for healthy human and planet health, healthy eating. And it's basically a flexitarian kind of model. It's based on the idea that we need to decrease our consumption of animal products, particularly red meat, also excess sugars, generally things that are like unnecessary, unnecessary additions to our food. And then we need to increase our consumptions of fruits, vegetables, legumes, and whole grains. And it's interesting because they really do focus on the increase part of it. So again, it is focusing on the positive, which is great. And they put together this model, a very reputable scientific journal, and they put together this model and ran the numbers on the amount that it would reduce environmental degradation. And it's quite significant that if everyone adopted the Eat Lancet Planetary Health Guidelines, it would really do a lot to address the environmental crisis. So we set that up. And then my part of the course is where then I raise the question of like, okay, so if that's the case, why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we all following the Lancet Planetary Health Diet Guidelines? And I take them through some reasons why we're not. So basically, I have like these 5 weeks where I set up the problems, the problem and the solution. So, well, part of the reason why we're not addressing the Lancet guidelines is because of overproduction in our food system. We produce about 50% more food than we should be eating. Basically, we produce between 3,000 and 4,000 calories per person equivalent of food per day. And if you assume that most people are eating a 2,000 calorie diet, we're producing 50 to 100% more than we need. And why do we do that? Well, because we have a subsidy system. We have a system that's set up to foster competition between food companies. So the idea is we just keep producing more and more. So that's part of it. We have a subsidy system that basically supports animal agriculture. It supports grazing, it supports dairy farms, and it also supports monocropping, feed crops. And those are all considered commodity crops, and fruits and vegetables are considered specialty crops. So that's kind of the opposite of what we need to be doing. We have a system that's based in labor exploitation. We have a system that's based in animal exploitation, and we've normalized those two things. And then we also have a system that's based around food oppression, where access to fresh fruit, vegetable, to legumes, whole grains, nuts, and seeds is not equivalent in different neighborhoods. The phenomenon that's sometimes called food deserts. So I set up all those problems, but then as part of that, I also introduce them to the solutions. What solutions are being leveraged at present? And we have a kind of template for analysis of those solutions. This is something that I borrowed from an activist named Nora Kramer, who runs an organization called Yay Camp that is about training young activists. And the structure of activism, as she puts it forward, is there's internal activism, individual action, community action, and institutional action. And what I think is so great about that framework, and particularly working that through with students in a kind of discussion format, is one of the things we really get to is that like internal activism, that's basically about changing our own perspective. It's about changing how we think about an issue. And you could look at the food system and say, who really cares what you think about food waste or what you think about animal ethics or labor rights? Like just changing your attitude isn't going to change anything. But we see very quickly that, when it comes to something like food waste, as soon as you start to think that you have responsibility for what you buy, not just in terms of your budget, but in terms of the environmental impact, in terms of the work that went into producing that food. As soon as you start to shift that attitude, then you can start to see where, oh, okay, maybe I'll start to make different choices. And then that leads to individual action. Or once you start to become aware that there's a subsidy system that's trying to get you to buy too much and that's trying to get you to buy animal products and processed foods, then you might think, oh, okay, so then maybe I have more of a reason to make that individual change. And then once you start making individual change, we don't live in a vacuum, so we might start to influence our community, but we might also feel motivated to encourage our community towards change. And then from there, our communities might then start thinking about making institutional change, putting different demands on our local and state and federal government, putting different demands on our schools and workplaces. And so all of those things are connected to each other. And yet at the same time, particularly when we're workshopping this in a class setting, we're also looking at how different kind of advocacy groups, they need to focus. So some are focused on individual choice, and some are focused on choice architecture, and some are lobbying the federal government or working with city governments. And that's also part of how activism works. We actually need all of that happening at once, so it puts pressure on the system from all sides.
That sounds great. Uh, I was going to mention that Climate Diet has a program called Power of Food, and we created a toolkit that we share. We're just working in Montgomery County, which is outside of Washington, D.C. and Maryland. So we share that, and we got a grant from Montgomery County Community Grants Program to share it with some of the schools in the county. And there we have actually a climate, I'll call her a climate czar for the county, which is really great. And they have an annual youth climate summit. And so I offered the program Power of Food. I think I'm kind of an outlier because there's a lot more discussion of what's more typical in thinking about the climate, and food is not everyone's first topic. But no one threw me out after I did my presentation, and we gave out vegan energy bars, so everyone was happy about that. And we gave out coupons also to Plant Burger, which offers plant-based burgers. And it was a pretty successful event. So I think at least locally, we're making a little bit of inroads.
Yeah.
Small, but
yeah, and I mean, I would say that's a big change that we've seen in the last few years. I mean, I think it was very much a niche thing like a few decades ago to talk about the environmental impact of animal agriculture. It'd be that sort of thing that people would be like, oh yeah, yeah, and we know, but that's not really the important thing. And now I think it's really come to the fore that this is an integral part of addressing environmental degradation.
well, before we sign off, because I know you have other commitments today, I have to show Erin Jane's Kitchen. I'm wearing my apron, and Climate Diet offers recipes, plant-based recipes every Friday. And I just want to encourage all the people that are going to be watching this to come to our website and sign up, and they can get our free recipes every week. And we do show the impact on the climate and the number of greenhouse gas emissions that are lowered as a result of eating that plant-based recipe.
That's
so
great.
Dr. O'Shea, thank you so much for once again joining us. And you've told us so much, and just so appreciate what you do for UCLA and what you do for sharing all these great thoughts with our viewers today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you, and thank you so much for the work that you're doing with Climate Diet.
Signing off, this is Jane DeMarines and Dr. Janet O'Shea, Climate and Cuisine. Take care, everybody.